and push play.
Okay, what is your name?
Bruce Curry.
And where are you from?
I'm from Ponca.
And how old are you?
I'm 74.
All right, were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted.
All right, do you recall your first day in the service?
I do. It was in Omaha. I was sworn in Omaha, and we were transported then to Kansas City, where we boarded a plane and flew to San Diego.
Okay. How did you get through the war?
Well, I completed 4 years in the Navy on the East Coast, and shortly after that I re-enlisted, and I was sent to the USS Perch in Subic Bay, Philippines. The USS Perch was a special ops submarine that was designed for carrying UDT or SEAL team. We carried some of each, and we were involved in special operations with them in Vietnam. We carried them from Subic Bay. We would go over and we would operate along the coastline of Vietnam in VC held areas, and we would go in as close as we could get to the coastline and bottom, and then we would lock out members of the SEAL team 2 at a time. They would then take their equipment, which included Zodiacs and other equipment that they had. They would inflate those, pop them to the surface, and then we would vector them into the beach where they needed to go for their operation. We would do that with sonar. I was a sonarman, so that was my job, to get them to where they needed to be. And then they would carry out their mission, and they would come back to the beach. This was all done at night, and then we would vector them back to the submarine, and they would deflate their Zodiacs. Those are inflatable boats. And they would bring all their equipment down, secure all that equipment in lockers outside the pressure hull that were watertight. And then they would lock back in through the escape trunk into the forward torpedo room, 2 at a time, until they all got back inside the submarine. And then we would back off the bottom, and we would go back out further from the coast, and the next night we would go in and do the same thing. And we would do that in a 30-day period. We would do that pretty much nightly. Sometimes it wouldn't be every night. A lot of times it would be every night. Sometimes it would be 2 or 3 days in between operations. And then we would go back to Subic Bay, after anywhere from 2 weeks to 30 days, and go through an upkeep. And then we would go back to Vietnam again. And so I did that for about 3 years. Half of that time was on the USS Perch, and then the USS Tunney came out and relieved the Perch. The USS Tunney was fitted for the same kind of warfare, and we did a crew swap. The crew that brought the Tunney out swapped with us, took the Perch back for decommissioning, and we stayed there on the Tunney. Now the Perch was the only submarine in history that received the combat patrol pin for 3 different wars. The Perch served in World War II, received the combat patrol pin there, the crew, for that time. They did several combat missions in World War II, and then in Korea they did, along with the Pickerel. They and the Pickerel both received the combat patrol pin then in Korea. And then again in Vietnam, the Perch also received, while I served on her, received the combat patrol pin. So it's the only submarine that ever received that distinction in 3 different wars. After the Tunney relieved the Perch, we continued doing the same kind of operations, and during that period of time, we did most of our operations at that point were becoming more and more with SEAL team and less with UDT. SEAL team was new in 1963. The SEAL team was born in 1963, if you will. And so slowly they were taking over the operations that the UDT had done prior to that. And so by the late 60s, we were pretty much operating with the SEAL team. And while on the Tunney, we did some operations with the submersible the SDV, or submersible delivery vehicle, it's a two-man submarine, free-floating submarine, had a range of 45 knots, nautical miles, and could carry 2 men and about 200 pounds of charge and explosives. We did some training with the SDV in Lingayen Gulf, which is north of Subic Bay on the island of Luzon there in the Philippines. And we carried the SDV, and we actually went to Vietnam several times on a particular mission, and we never did carry that out. That was never, we'd get over in the area, and we'd be ready, and we'd get called back. So we never did do an operation, a combat operation with the submarine, with the submersible delivery vehicle. All of our operations in Vietnam, combat operations, were lockout operations with the EDT SEAL team. On a couple of occasions, we actually took fire. On one occasion, we bottomed very closer in than we normally would, that we were within 500 yards of the beach. And on that particular night, the officer in charge of the SEAL team was new and had no combat experience, and he didn't want to relinquish any of his authority to any of the enlisted men who were combat experienced. And we locked them out, and one thing led to another. His inexperience caused problems, and after we locked the team out, they began to take fire from VC position on the shore. We surfaced to take them back aboard, and we took some fire. We had deck guns on the perch, and we fired back in and silenced the guns on the beach. And then we got everybody but 2 of the team back on board. We couldn't find the other 2. So at daybreak, we began a search. We did a grid search, and about 11 o'clock in the morning, we found the 2 swimmers. They were 15 miles out to sea, and they were fine. They were a bit hungry, but other than that, they were fine. So, that ended that operation. We didn't lose anybody. Nobody was wounded. Nobody was lost.
Wow.
We didn't lose anybody in any of our operations over there, which was very fortunate. All of our operations, as you could maybe understand, were clandestine. We didn't want to be seen or heard, and to be seen or heard would pretty much defeat the mission. So generally, we would go in and bottom, carry out our operation, and the enemy would never know that we'd been there until they felt the effects of the visit by the SEAL team or UDT.
Will you explain your photos on the table?
Oh, the picture of the USS Perch is a picture taken from a Navy P-3, that's anti-submarine warfare 4-engine prop plane, taken as we were crossing the South China Sea. And I don't know if this was going toward Vietnam or going back to Subic, but it was in the South China Sea. And you can see, if you look, you can see the forward deck gun just forward of the bridge and forward of where the periscope and the masts are. You can also see the flag flying on the after end of what we call the shears, at the end of what we also call the cigarette deck, where we can, if we're on the surface, we can go topside and sit back in that area. You can also see the exhaust of one of the engines on the port side aft, about a little over 3/4 of the way to the stern. You can see the water shooting out the side. That's cooling water that cools the exhaust from one of the engines there. The Perch had been modified greatly and only had 2 engines. Normally, the submarines of this type would have 4 engines, 2 in the forward engine room, 2 in the rear, in the after engine room. This particular submarine was modified, and what had originally been the forward engine room was made into a berthing compartment so that we could carry the SEAL UDT team. However, we carried them all in the forward torpedo room, and the forward engine room converted to berthing then was used by the crew rather than by UDT or SEAL. And the reason for that being that the escape trunk was in the forward torpedo room, and we needed to have the teams where the escape trunk was so that we could do our lockouts and lock-ins from that particular area.
Did you make any close friends while you were in the service?
Yes, we have, I served on 4 different submarines, and we have reunions. Our reunions started in the early 2000s, and I've been to several reunions for this particular submarine, for the Perch and the Angler, the first submarine I served on. I've been to several reunions for that particular submarine. So yes, I stay in touch with several people that I made friends with, and we all were on first name basis, and yes, we were quite close. Submarine crews are more like family than any other ships in the Navy. We had a crew of 72 men and 8 officers, so as you can imagine, when you live on a pipe that's 305 feet long and 16 feet wide in the widest spot, that you know everybody quite well.
Yeah. Why did you join? Why did you enlist in the war?
Well, I enlisted actually before the Vietnam War actually started. I enlisted because I family history of serving. I have an uncle that served in both World War I and World War II. I have another uncle that served in World War I only. He was not Navy. The one that served in World War I and World War II was Navy. My brother served in Korea. I served in Vietnam, and my oldest son served in the invasion of Iraq. And now my youngest son is serving. He's a lieutenant currently in the Navy, and he flies P-8s. So I basically enlisted because obviously I love my country and I wanted to serve. And once I got in, I looked at the different options, and I decided that submarines would be fitting for myself, and that's the direction I went. Submarine service is all volunteer. There is no one serving in submarines who is not a volunteer. So it's an all volunteer service.
Is there anything, or were you awarded any medals or any honorable mention?
Of course, I have my dolphins. Everybody that serves in submarines, if you stay in submarines, you have to qualify, and when you qualify, you get what we call dolphins. It's a device that you wear along with your medals, ribbons, and so forth. So I have that. I have combat patrol pin that we got for our operations in Vietnam, and I have numerous ribbons. I have the good conduct first, second, third award. I have numerous other ribbons, probably the most important of which is the meritorious unit commendation that we got for a particular operation in Vietnam. And the Vietnam Service ribbon, the Vietnam Campaign ribbon, and many others that are what we refer to in the Navy as gedunk ribbons that we got for less important operations. So, yes.
Is there anything that we didn't ask you that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I enjoyed my time in the service, and as I said earlier, I developed many friendships that still continue today. Other than that, I think you've asked the questions, and I've covered pretty much everything. Do you have any other questions?
No, that's it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.